In this lecture, we're going to learn about functions. A function is a reusable piece of code that you can use multiple times to do different things. It can take input, and once it has input, it can do some processing, and when the processing is done, the function can optionally give you a result. You can think of a function as a machine, which can take input and give you some output. When you give input to the machine is going to do some processing, and then it's going to give you the output, and the output is going to be dependent on the input that you gave to the machine. This is really how a function works in C++. And once you have the machine set up, you can really reuse it however many times you want. Let's look at how a function looks in C++. The syntax is this. You first specify the return type, which may be int, double, or whatever. After that, you're going to specify the function name. And after that, you're going to have a pair of parentheses. Inside these parentheses, you're going to have your parameters, which is going to be a comma-separated list of things you pass to the function. And after all these parameters, you're going to have a pair of curly braces. And inside those curly braces, we're going to have the body of the function. We're going to be doing our processing in the body. And when the processing is done, we can get the result of the function through this return mechanism here. So if we want to get something out of the function, we have to return that thing, and it is going to be visible to whoever used this function. Here is a simple example of a function with no input and output. The syntax is going to be this. Void means that this function is not going to return anything. And you notice that our pair of parentheses is empty because we have no input in this function. We have our curly braces, and inside these curly braces is going to be the body of this function. It's going to do some processing. And when processing is done, we return out of this function. Now, remember that I said that this function doesn't return anything because it is of void type here, but we can return. And I'm going to show you the exact syntax of how you can do that. Okay, so we can have many functions in C++, but each function has to be unique. Otherwise, you're going to have problems in your C++ programs. A function is going to be unique based on its signature. And a signature is really a function name plus the function parameters. If we go back to our example here and try to figure out the signature of this function, it's going to be function name and plus the parameters, and you see that we have no parameters in here. So this signature is going to uniquely identify this function in our C++ program. If we set up another function that has this same function name and doesn't take any parameter, we're going to have problems, even if we happen to have a different return value for the function. And don't worry if this is not making sense yet. We will see a lot of examples, and I am sure by the time we are done with this lecture, you will be a master at using functions. Okay, now that we have seen how we can declare or define a function in C++, let's see how we can use the function. And when you call a function, in most cases, you will want to get something out of that function. So suppose here result var is a variable that is going to catch the result of the function. And we're going to call the function with a syntax like this. We're going to say the function name, we're going to put our pair of parentheses here, and we are going to pass in the arguments or the values of our parameters. This is the syntax. It is going to call the function, and the result of the function is going to be assigned to this result var variable of ours. Here is how you can call a function that doesn't take any parameter. The parameter list is basically going to be empty. And now we're going to look at a few examples of how you can really declare functions in your C++ program. For example, here we have a function called into_bar. It doesn't return anything, so we can't catch the result of this function. And it's going to have one input in the form of an integer. So the parameter is called age here, it's an integer. And inside the function, we are going to test if somebody is old enough to enter a bar. So we do a test to see if the age is greater than 18. If it is, we're going to tell them, please proceed. If the age is not greater than 18, we're going to tell them you cannot enter. This is an example of a function you can set up in your C++ programs. Here is another function that is going to compute the maximum between two numbers. It is going to give us a result, so the return value is an integer here. The function name is max, and we're going to put in our list of parameters. And again, these are the parameters. When you are defining your function, this comma-separated list of things we have in this parenthesis are called parameters. And when you call the function, the values that you pass in the places of these parameters are called arguments. So these are a few terms that can really throw you off, and I just want you to be super clear about these things. Once we have the signature of the function set up, we jump in the body and we do whatever we want this function to do. So we're going to say, if a is greater than b, then a must be the maximum. We're going to send that back to whoever called this function. Or in other words, we're going to return a. And if a is not greater than b, then b must be the maximum, and we're going to return it. That's what we're saying here. Here is another example of a function that doesn't have any output and doesn't take any input. It doesn't return anything because the return type is void, and it doesn't take any input because the parameter list here is empty. In the body of the function, we're just going to greet somebody and tell them hello there, and we're going to return out of the function. Notice that for a void function, we can either omit the return statement here, or we can just put it in like this, say return and a semicolon, and whatever C++ compiler you are using is going to accept this as valid C++ syntax. Here is another example of a function that returns something but doesn't take any input. The return value is going to be an integer, but we don't need to pass something to this function when we call it. It's just going to give us output. We can call it and get our lucky number and use that however we want in our C++ application. I think we have seen a lot of examples of how we can set up functions. Now let's see how we can call these functions. Here is a simple C++ program. In the main function, we just set up a few variables, a value, b value, a and b here, and we use those variables to call functions. Remember, we set up an iter bar function. The function looked like this, and it was testing to see if somebody's age was greater than 18. If the age is greater than 18, they are going to enter the bar. If the age is not greater than 18, we won't let them in. The function takes input, but it doesn't return anything. So we can call this function like we do here and say into bar. And you notice that we're not catching something out of this function. We're just going to call it, and we're going to give it input, which is 22 here. And the function is going to do its thing. So it's going to let us in because our age is greater than 18. Down here, you see we are calling the max function here. We are giving it two inputs, a value and b value, and it's going to return something. And the return value of this function is going to be used to initialize this maximum number variable here. This is what we are doing. If we go down, we see that we can call the maximum function directly and use its return value in an std_cout statement here. And this is going to print out the maximum between a and b. And down here, you see we have the function say hello, which is going to just greet somebody and not return anything. Here is another example of how you can call the lucky number. You say lucky number, you pass a pair of parentheses, and this is going to return the lucky number and print it out in this std_cout statement here. Down here, we set up a few variables, a and b, and we are going to use them to call the maximum functions. You see we call max a, b, or we can even pass in number literals like we are doing down here. One thing I want you to be careful about is implicit conversions that might happen when you are calling your functions. Suppose we have a minimum function like we see here, which is going to be taking in integer parameters. But here we are calling the function with f and g, which happen to be of double type like we see on top here. So what is going to happen is the compiler is going to notice that what you are passing in is not really what the function takes. But the compiler knows that it can insert a transformation from double to integer, and it is going to do that without your involvement. So be really careful about implicit conversions and make sure they are working to your advantage. Otherwise, you're going to have really hard to debug problems in your C++ programs. One other thing I want you to be aware of is that if we have a function set up like this function is going to be taking parameters as copies. So if you have two variables, for example, C and D, and you call this function with those two variables, you're not going to be manipulating those two variables. What you will be working with inside the body of this function are going to be copies of the parameters that you passed in here. So if, for example, you happen to increment either of the parameters, for example, here we increment A and we increment B, the changes we make here inside the body of the function are just going to be affecting copies we have inside the function here. And these copies are going to die the moment we hit the end of this function here. This is something I want you to be aware of, and we will play with that in more detail when we hit Visual Studio Code in a minute. Here is a simple example of how you can call that function. We have two variables, h and I, and we are going to print them out. After that, we're going to call the function. We're going to store the result back in increment result. But the important thing is that we call the function here with h and I. Remember, in the body of the function, we are incrementing h and I as arguments, but the changes we do inside the body of the function are not going to be visible when the function returns. If we print h and I here, we're just going to see the same thing we saw before we called the function. I realize this is a lot of information to take in. Now we are going to head over to Visual Studio Code and actually play with this step by step. Okay, here we are in our working directory. The chapter is on functions. The current lecture is first hand on functions. We are going to grab our template files like we always do. We're going to put this in, and we are going to open this in Visual Studio Code. Let's open the folder, and we are going to go in the correct chapter and choose first hand on functions here. This is what we want to open. And we are going to open our main CPP file and clean it up a little bit. And the first thing we want to do is to set up a function that takes a single parameter and doesn't give back any result. So the function is going to be interbar. We have seen that. The function is not going to return anything, so it's going to be void. Its return type is going to be void. The name of the function is going to be interbar. And what we want to pass in here is a variable to represent the age of somebody. And we know that the age can really not be negative, so it is advised to at least use an unsigned integer type. So we're going to use unsigned int, and the parameter name is going to be called age. Once we have our parameter list, we're going to put in the function body. And remember, the function body is going to live within these two curly braces. Now this is a valid C++ function. It's not going to return anything. It's going to take a single parameter whose type is unsigned int. Its name is interbar. We can get inside the function and actually do whatever it is we want to do. So once we go in, we're going to test and see if the age is greater than 18, do something. If the age is not greater than 18, we're going to do something else. Let's do that. We're going to say if age is greater than 18, we're going to tell them the age and tell them that they can actually go in. This is logical. And we're going to say else. And in the body of this else block, we're going to say something else. We're going to tell them, sorry, you are too young for this, and we are going to get out of this block here. And this is really our function. Again, let's try to analyze the syntax here. We have the return type. This is required in C++. If you don't put it in, you're going to get a compiler error because you can't have a function without a return type in C++. You notice that we have our squiggly lines here. Visual Studio Code is not happy. So we're going to tell it the return type. We're going to say the function name after that. And after the function name, we're going to pass the parameters. We can have any number of parameters or inputs to the function, but in this case, we just have one because it is enough for our purposes. After that, we have the body, and inside the body, we do whatever it is we want to do in this function here. Because this function returns void, we don't really need to explicitly return from this function here. But this is an exception only for functions that return void. For other return types, you will have to put in the return statement. But even for void functions, you can put the return statement if you want. And you can do that like this. Say return, and you're going to put a semicolon after this. This is also valid C++ syntax. Okay, now we have declared the function. It is a valid C++ function. Let's try and call it. We're going to go down in main because that's where we want to be calling our functions for now. And we are going to say interbar. We're going to call the function, and you use the function name to call it. And you're going to put in a pair of parentheses and pass an argument to the function. Again, what you pass to the function when you call it is called an argument. But what you pass to the function when you are defining it like we did here, that's a parameter. Okay, so function parameters when declaring functions, and when you are calling the function, what you pass are function arguments. And now we need to pass in some age to this function, and let's say 22. And if we do that, this is going to be a valid C++ program. Notice that we have this squiggly line. It is because we forgot a semicolon here, because C++ requires to have a semicolon after each statement. And now we have a valid C++ program that is declaring a function and calling a function down here in main. We can try to build it. Let's use GCC to do that. The build is going to be good. You see, build finished successfully. And we can bring up a terminal and actually try to run this function here. Let's clear and run Rooster because our program is going to be called Rooster like we have been doing all along. And the output is going to be, you are 22, please proceed. Notice that we have this function defined once, but we can call it multiple times. So for example, if we go down here and say interbar, and we give it 15 as the age, and we try and build again. Let's build with GCC. The build is going to be good. We can clear and run Rooster. Now it's going to say you are 15, please proceed. Why is that? What are we really doing here? If age is greater than 10, we said 10 here. We should say 18. Sorry for this. We're going to build again. And now it should behave accordingly. So let's say Rooster here. You are 22, please proceed. You are too young for this, no offense, because the age is 15 here. You can keep calling this function and you're going to see things printing out. You can even call this function in a loop. I can't really resist, so let's do that. We're going to say for size t I and say start from 0, for example, or 1, why not? And we are going to say while I is less than 10 or 20. And we're going to increment I. You already know how to use loops, so we're going to be using this as an example. And we can comment out all these guys in front because we don't want them to print stuff by now. And what we're going to do is call the function with whatever iteration we are at. Notice that we have a size t here, and the function is going to be taking an unsigned integer. So we're going to have implicit conversions from size t to int. Or if we really want this to not cause any problems, we can change the type of our parameter to be size t. This is also valid C++ code. Let's say size t properly. And if we go down here, we're going to say interbar, and we're going to pass in I. Watch what is going to happen. This is going to loop from 1 all the way to 19, and it's going to be calling this function with whatever iteration we might be at. So it's going to loop from 1 all the way to 18, and it's going to tell us we are too young for this. But for 19, it's going to let us in because we will be old enough to enter a bar. Let's try this. I think it's going to be fun. We're going to build with GCC, and we're going to clear and run Rooster. Sorry, you're too young for this. You're too young for this. And once we hit 19, it's going to tell us we are young enough to enter a bar, and we're going to go in and have as much fun as we want. So this is really how you can declare a function. Remember, a function is uniquely identified by its signature, and the signature is really the name of the function and the parameters that you have in here. Okay, once you have the function declared, you're going to do whatever you want in the body. You are going to optionally return something from the function. And once the function is declared or set up, you can go in main and call it and do whatever it is you want with it. Okay, now I think we are mature enough to try out a few other functions. Let's go down and put in another function which is going to compute the maximum of two numbers. The signature of this function is going to be its name here and the parameters. Notice that we are taking two parameters because we want to be computing the maximum between two numbers. And this function is going to return something. We want to get the maximum out of the function and use it to do something else when we call it. So this is the declaration of the function. Once we hit the body of the function, we are going to compute the maximum. We're going to say if a is greater than b, then a must be our maximum. So we're going to return that. And if a is not greater than b, then b must be the maximum. We're going to return b as our maximum here. This is what the function is doing. We can go in main and call it. Let's go down and comment this out because we don't want noise output from these guys. So calling into bar. That's what we were doing. Now we are calling max. So we're going to go down and set up a variable, call it result, why not? And we're going to compute the maximum between 10 and 20, why not? Okay, so let's see what we get. And we're going to print the maximum this time. We're going to say max is result. Okay, now if we build this program and run it, try to guess what we're going to get. We're going to call the maximum function. And what we pass in here are arguments. Again, we are not passing parameters here. We are going to pass in 10 and 20 as our arguments. And when we call the function, control is going to jump to the body of the function and we are going to fall inside here. The arguments we're going to pass in are just going to be copied in the function and we will have them through these names A and B. So we're going to test and see if the first parameter is greater than the second. In this case, the first parameter is not greater than the second because the first one is 10, the second is a 20. Let's go down and see that. And the test here is going to fail and we're going to run whatever is in the else block here. And we are going to return B as our maximum. When we return B, B is going to basically be the result of this expression here. And that result is going to be assigned to our result variable and we're going to print it out with this stdc out statement here. So let's try and build this. We're going to build with GCC. Again, the build is going to be good. We're going to clear and run Rooster. You see that maximum is 20. If we try and change this, for example, make the first parameter 100 and build again, let's see what maximum we get. Going to clear and run Rooster. We're going to say that maximum is 100. And again, you can call this function however many times you want. For example, we can call it again and say result equals max using two variables that we have, let's say x and y, and go on top and declare these two variables. Why not? We're going to say int x and we're going to put in it 22 and we're going to say int y and put in a 44. Why not? And now if we print the result, we're going to get 44 because that's the maximum that was assigned back to our result variable here. Let's build again. We're going to run the task to build with GCC. Can clear and run Rooster. You see max is 44. And this is really how you can declare and use a maximum function like this. We're going to comment this out because we have a few more functions we want to try out. Let's go on top and put in another function. And again, notice that we are declaring functions before the main function here. This is a requirement of a C++ compiler because before you use the function must be declared somewhere. So we need to go before the main function and declare our functions here. The function we're going to do now is say hello here. It's not going to take any input and it's not going to give us any output. It's just going to say hello and die off. We can go down and call it. This is going to be super easy, calling hello. And we're going to call it, say hello. You see that even Visual Studio Code knows about this function. We can call it like this. It's going to be activated. So we're going to hit the body of the function. We're going to say hello there. And the function is going to return or die off. Please know that you could omit this return statement for functions that return void. So if we comment this guy out, the function is going to work equally well. You can use this however you want. Now we're just going to build with GCC and see this function run. The build is good. We're going to run Rooster and it is saying hello there. Let's go down and look at another example here. The next function is going to be lucky number. It's not going to take any input, but it is going to give us an output in the form of an integer, so we can call it. Let's go down and comment out saying hello here and say that we want to call lucky number. And we can go down and set up a variable. Let's do that. We're going to say int result, and we are going to brace initialize this guy, so it's going to be initialized to 0. And we're going to say result equals lucky number. And we're going to take the result returned by our lucky number function and assign that to the result variable, and we can print it out if we want. So we can say stdc out and say result, and we're going to put that out here, say result. And if we build and run this program, we're going to get this guy printed out. We should see a 99 because that's what we are returning from our function here. And result is 99 as you see in the output here. So this is really how you can declare your functions. A function has a unique signature. So for example, Intobar here has this particular name and these parameters here. If you go down, max has its own name and the parameters that it takes in. If you go down, say hello and lucky number are different in their own ways. If you try and set up another function that has the same signature as max here, your compiler is going to freak out. Let's try and do that. We're going to set up another function. It's going to have a void return type. We're going to call it max because we want to match this signature here. And we're going to give it two parameters, int a and int b. And we can do whatever we want in this function. Notice that we have a squiggly line. If we open our problems tab here, you're going to see that Visual Studio Code has a few problems with this because we are setting up a function with the same signature twice. Let's try and even make this an int and see what we get. Right now, we don't seem to have a problem, but if we get to run this program, we're going to have problems. Let's go down and actually activate the code to call the max function to really show you this because you need to know. So we're going to comment out calling lucky number and we want to call max. We're going to activate the code to call max and we are going to build this with GCC. Notice what we're going to see. We have problems here. We have a compiler error saying redefinition of int max int int. And one might think, what if I name my parameters differently here? For example, I call this guy C and this other guy D. Let's do that. Using different names like this is not going to solve your troubles because if we try and build again, we're going to get the same compiler error. So this is not going to change a thing. We don't have enough tools to really understand this problem, but know that you can't have two functions with the exact same signature in a single C++ program. And we're going to learn more about this later, but note that the signature of a function must be unique to it throughout your entire C++ program. If you remember this simple rule, you're not going to have many problems. So let's try and build again to make sure we have no more problems in here. The build is good. And we can run the program to see our maximum printed out. So let's do that. Clear, rooster, and max is 44. It is exactly what we expect. The last thing I want to do in this lecture is make it super clear in your mind that what we pass to functions we have been setting up so far are copies. So let's go on top and set up a simple function. The function is going to increment and multiply. It returns a double type. The name of the function is increment and multiply, and it is going to take two parameters in, a double A and a double B. Once we hit the body of the function, we're going to increment A and B, the arguments that were passed to the function, and we're going to multiply them, and we're going to store the result of that in a result variable. The result variable is what we're going to return to the function, and whoever called this function is going to use that to do whatever they want. What we really want to see is that the changes we do inside the function are not going to be visible to the arguments that we pass to this function here. To really make this super clear, let's go down in main and set up a few variables. We're going to have a double H and a double I. The values are going to be 3 and 4. We're going to print them out. And we're going to call our increment multiply function. Notice that we pass h and I to the function, and the result of the function is going to be stored in the increment result variable here. But the return value is really not important. What we want to see is if the changes we do to the arguments are going to be visible on the outside of the function here. So remember, we have h and I here. We pass them to the function. Once we hit the inside of the function, we're going to increment a and b, and we are going to return from the function. So let's see if a, which was a 3, and b, which was a 4, have been incremented to 4 and 5. That's what we want to see. So we're going to build this and run this. So let's use GCC to do that. The build is going to be good. We're going to clear and run Rooster. And notice what we have here. Let's go down and look at the variables again. We set up h to contain a 3. So before we increment, h and I are 4. Okay, so that's what we're going to print here. Once we hit the inside of the function, we are going to say what we have inside the function before we do the operation, before the increment. Again, a and b are 4. So these are copies we have inside. We're going to do the increment, and after we have the increment, a and b are going to be 4. But once we hit the outside of the function and print with this guy here, we're going to see that h and I are still 3 and 4. So we didn't really affect h and I when we did this increment here. What we affected are copies that were passed to a and b here. And this is something you need to know, because some people will think that because I pass h and I in my argument list here, I can manipulate h and I. What you are manipulating are copies that were made by the compiler to pass the arguments to the function here. This is something you need to keep in mind, and we will learn more about this, but I wanted you to learn this firsthand. And this is really all we set out to do in this lecture. I hope you have a better understanding of what a function is and what you can do with it in C++. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to learn a little more about function declarations and function definitions. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.